In this chapter, we'll go deeper into several advanced scenarios that are commonly encountered by report designers and developers. We'll see how to set up report parameters and how to use them to filter report data and to pass the report name to the report for code for exporting purposes. I'll show you how to get a hold of the user identity that is passed from the runtime to the report, and also how you can pass custom objects along with user identities and consume them in the report. We'll see how to configure rendering and paging for reports, as well as how to support multiple languages and regions via report globalization. Finally, I'll show you an example of an integrated web report designer that you can add to your own application. If you got stuck at any point during the previous chapter, or if you just jumped into this chapter, you can download the code base as we have it at this point in the course, using a separate branch in the same repository. Head over to our project reporting repository here, and then, instead of the master branch, select the basics complete branch. This branch already has all the configuration for our project, as well as the server-side API implementation and the report itself already in place. So if you have this repository already cloned, just check out this branch, but make sure you save your work until now just in case. Or you can just download the code from this branch as a zip file. Open up the solution in Visual Studio and make sure that rps.web is set as the startup project. It'll be highlighted in bold here. Also make sure that inside this project you have the reports folder and that you have RPS dashboard report in there. Now, if you take a look at app settings.json, you will see that we have a connection string here, and this is my connection string to my machine. So make sure that you have your data source set pointing to your machine here, and that you have that database ready to go. This is something we did in the previous chapters. Open up your reports folder and the RPS dashboard report in Telerik Report Designer. It probably will not look like this, at least not right away, because your connection string will be wrong. So right click on this chart data source, click configure, use the existing data connection if you have one, use a shared connection, configure, and you should have this local RPS data connection here. Make sure that this can connect to your local database, and the select statement should already be ready to go. When you execute the query, you should get some data back here. Also select your RPS items data source and make sure you're also pointing to the same data connection, and you can click through and make sure you're getting data here as well. After you reconfigure your data connection, your graph should look something like this. Make sure you save your report and then go back to Visual Studio and run your project. The RPS Tracker web application should open up, and when you navigate to the report page, you should see the report load and show up here just like this. If it doesn't, there might be something wrong with your connection strings or connection settings, so make sure you've reviewed the previous chapters. This is going to be the starting point of this chapter. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at report parameters. Parameters are typically used to filter report data that is retrieved from the data source or after the data is retrieved from the data source. And this is done often to improve performance for processing and viewing the report. Let's take a look at an example of implementing parameters in our report. If we take a look at our running application, we have a chart on the dashboard, and you'll see 3 buttons here that allow us to filter by 3 months, 6 months, or 1 year. When you click each one of those buttons, a parameter is sent, which is the number of months, and that filters the chart. We want to do something similar with our own report. So let's go back to the report designer, and we'll handle it here. One way to do this is to configure our data source, and then we can alter our select statement here to include a parameter. However, I'm going to take this opportunity to show you yet another way that we can filter the data once you've already fetched it, because some of the power of Telerik reporting lies in the filtering the data within the report itself. The first thing we're going to do is actually set up a new data source to provide us with the values for the number of months. So let's go up to the data tab, and we're going to use a CSV data source this time. Here you can use a file, or you can use inline comma-separated values. Since we only have a few values, it's actually a good option. I'm going to start by typing the header, which is time span. This will actually become the name of our field, and then 3 values, 3, 6, and 12. These are the number of months. Let's click next, and we can leave the defaults as is because we only have 1 column and each record is on its own line. So let's continue. Here are some more configuration options for how you want to interpret the data. And down here, the preview looks pretty good. Let's click next and check that the CSV has headers. Click next. Here's an important bit. The type of the time span is actually going to be an integer. So make sure you select that here because we're going to be using it in an integer calculation later on to filter the report. Let's click Next and click Parse CSV to test it out. Make sure your data is showing up here and click Finish. The CSV data source is now showing up here. We can rename it and give it a better name. Let's call it Time Span Data Source. Now we want this graph over here to consume the time span data source via a parameter. And there's a number of ways we can get a parameter to the graph. One thing we can do is in Report Explorer, use this parameters area, right click on this and click on Add Parameter. We can set up our parameters here. For example, for the name, we can set this to be time span. For the type, it'll be an integer. And for the available values, we can expand that and select the data source to be the time span data source. That's one way to do it, but I'm going to cancel this because there's a different way I want to show you as well. In the Report Explorer, select the graph itself, then go to Properties, and under Data Source, you have another property called Filters. This is where we filter the data right after it comes in from the data source based on certain criteria. Click on this little expansion field, and this will bring up a familiar expression dialog so you can edit your filters. Now, what we want to have happen is we want to filter the dates of the items based on the number of months that are selected. So for example, if 12 months are selected, then we want to show the last 12 months of the data. If 3 months are selected in the parameter, then we want to show only 3 months of the data. Create a new filter, and we're going to use an expression. This is going to be based on the date created field. For the operator, we want to select greater or equal to, and then we can enter a value here. We don't have a filter value yet here, and if you had a static value, you can put that in here, but we're going to use this dropdown to create a new report parameter. So click on that, and this will bring up that dialog we've seen earlier. All right, so we've done something similar before. Under available values, expand that and select the time span data source for the data source. For the display member, click this little button and select fields time span. Double click on that to get it up here in the expression, and then click OK. And for the value member, do the same thing. Click on this little ellipsis, select fields, and double click on time span, and then click OK. So that's the available values. You can collapse that. Under name, give it a good name like time span. Let's put time span in the text property as well. For the type, make sure that this is an integer. And for the value, click on the ellipsis. This has to be some kind of aggregate function based on the time span. So we're going to use max, then fields, time span. Click OK here. Now this last one is visible. That's an interesting one because this allows us to either hide or show the parameters in our final report viewer. Do we want the user to be able to edit the parameters or do we not? In our case, we do. So I'm going to set this to true and click OK. And since we're letting the users modify the parameters, we want the graph to react to the parameter change. So we want to set auto refresh to true as well. And let's click OK. This parameter should now be part of your report. Let's click OK. You can always go back and modify that parameter. It's going to be under parameters up here in the Report Explorer. Now we need to modify that filter a bit. So let's go back to Graph and then Filters and then open up that dialog. This is not exactly correct. Even though we've set up this parameter, we can't match the expression of date created with the value of time span just yet. So what we're going to do is build up another expression. So from the dropdown, select expression here. By the way, this is how you would reference report parameters in here. They're also listed under report parameters. We're going to remove that. What we want to do instead is get the time now and then subtract the number that was selected from the user selected parameter. So under functions, we have an add months function, which is going to be under date and time. And there it is. And to get the time right now, we're going to use the now function. Now we're going to convert our parameter to integer. So let's go under conversion, cint. Now our parameter is already an integer, but this is just a safety measure here. Here I'm going to select report parameters, expand time span, and then value. Now these are going to be positive integers. We want to subtract these. So we need to multiply that by -1. Click OK, and then OK one more time. You can test out our handiwork by going to Home and then Preview, and then you'll see a live time span parameter that you can play with. So you can select 6 months, 3 months, and then 12 months. You can toggle this parameter area in the settings here. You can turn the parameters on or off right here. Now let's go back to Design View, make sure everything is saved, and let's see what this looks like in our running application. I did not need to restart my app. It was already running, but I did go to the report tab, which allowed the report to be reloaded, including our new parameter area. And there's our time span. We can now select 12, 3, or 6 right inside of our application. So that's an example of report parameters. Before we go forward, let's take a look at how we can export our reports and how we can change the name of the file that's downloaded. If we go to the report page in the application, the report viewer loads the report, and we have an export button right here at the top next to the print button. The download options are PDF, CSV, Excel, PowerPoint, rich text, image file, or Word document. Let's take a look at the image file export, and that gives you an image that looks exactly like the design report, which is the intention here, of course. If we take a look at the CSV output, you'll see the chart data points printed out, separated by commas. This is probably more useful for tabular data if you need that. And finally, let's take a look at PDF. This is pretty self-explanatory. You get a PDF output. But notice the file names of all these downloads that we've had match the name of our project file, RPS Dashboard Report. This is the same file name that we have here in our project. So how would we change that name of the file, and how do we make it more dynamic? Well, now that you know how to create parameters, we can create a parameter in our report that's going to rename that file. Open up the report file in Report Designer. Let's go to Report Explorer, and under parameters, we're going to create a new parameter. I'm going to call this one report name. It's going to be of type string, and we'll set auto refresh to true. That's in case you have some kind of dynamic input on the front end and you want to let the user change the report name or control it somehow. This setting will help with that. And finally, let's give this report a default name. This could be anything really. It could be the string my report. Let's click OK here and OK one more time. And there's our new global parameter called report name. Now, to have the report name reflected in our download, we need to set a global document name. So in the Report Explorer, select the report, and then in the Properties panel, scroll all the way down to Document Name. Here we're going to use this little ellipsis to create an expression out of report parameters. We're going to expand report name and double-click on value here. Let's click OK, and now you should see document name equals parameters report name value. Let's save this and go back to our app. Now, when we download the PDF, for example, we'll get a PDF with the file name of my report because that was the default value we gave to our report name. So how can we dynamically change that value? Well, let's go back to Visual Studio, and under Components, let's open our report.razor page. This report viewer component can actually pass parameters behind the scenes to our report. We're providing the report source, which is actually of type report source options. And here we can actually provide key value pairs for different options and the parameters we want to pass in. So let's give it a parameter object here, and we'll call this one report name. This parameter name must match the name of the parameter in the report definition, which is report name. So here let's pass in the report name of all issues, which happens to be the name of our chart. You can hard code it here. Or if you want to make this even more dynamic, you could override onInitialized and initialize report source in here. We need to also declare report source. There we go. This will allow us to make the name of the report dynamic. Let's call a new property report name, and we need to create a new property up here called report name. And just for now, we'll initialize this to all issues. This way, you can always change that property while the application is running. Let's take a look at what this looks like. There's our report, and I'm going to download the PDF here. And you'll see that we have a new PDF called All Issues. If we open up that dynamic name of the file, we have the exact same report inside. You might have a need in your reports to access the current identity of the user that views the report, whether you want to limit what the report is showing based on the user's permissions or role in your organization, or maybe you just want to customize the report for each user. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to create a brand new Blazor project just as a demo. And for authentication type, I want to use individual accounts so that we have users in the context. And just like before, I'm going to quickly add a new reporting item with Telerik Blazor Report Viewer Native. And I'll leave the name Report Viewer Page. That's fine. And just like before, I'll go through this wizard to create my new page. There's our sample report. The route that's created for me is Report Viewer. So let's go to Nav menu. And instead of this counter, I'm just going to put in Report Viewer here. Let's call this link report. All right, let's start the app. Now this app does have authentication. So let's go to login. you'll need to log in here, but we don't have an account yet, so we need to register one. I'll register my account here. And of course, our application is using Entity Framework, so this allows me to automatically add that migration for the identity schema. Let's refresh that page. All right, registration confirmation. We need to make sure we click this link, otherwise your account will be lost and you won't be able to access it. So click this link to confirm your account. Thank you for confirming. Now we can log in. And I apologize to those that are familiar with this process, but some of you might not be. When I log in here, I will have my identity right here. alex@nuvias.com. So now this application has my user in the context. What about our report? Here's our report with the sample. We want to pass in that user into the report. So let's do that now. Let's open up that report in Report Designer. Now I just want to display the username. So let's go to Insert and then drop in a text box here. Make sure your text box is selected here, and in the Properties panel, go to Bindings. Right now there's no bindings. Open up this ellipsis, create a new binding, and we're going to bind the text box's value, and we're going to use the expression builder here. Let's create a new expression. Now if you take a look at global objects, which is an area we haven't looked at before, you'll see user identity options down here. We want to use user identity name, but you can also check to see if user is authenticated, if you want to hide or show certain parts of the report. Let's display the name and click OK here, and OK one more time. Make sure you save the report, and let's run that Blazor app one more time. Notice I'm still logged in here. I'm going to go to the report page, and there is my name in the report. Now, data binding is not the only way you can bind the value of the text box to useridentity.name. There is a more performant way of doing it. Let's go back to the text box, select it, open up bindings, and I'm going to delete this one. Okay. And instead of binding through the bindings property, we're going to set the value directly. You can open this up, and right now it's set to text box 2, but you can also use an expression here, and you can type in useridentity.name. Of course, it's also available under global objects, just like before. And that'll give you the same results. Let's go to report, and there's the name. By the way, if we export this to PDF, for example, you'll see that the name is there in the export as well. Now, besides just accessing the name, you can tap into the identity context and pass any object you want to the report. In order to do that, we're going to go back to our code, and let's open up the controllers folder and the reports controller. Here we're going to override a method that's available on the reports controller base that comes with Telerik reporting. Let's go over here, and we're going to do protected override get user identity. This fetches the user identity for the report, and we can modify the identity here. So instead of directly returning this, I'm going to save it off to identity. And my identity has a context property. I'm going to create a new one. This is of type concurrent dictionary. That's in system collections concurrent dictionary. Instead of string, this is going to be string object. So we can pass in any object we want. Now we can pass in any property into the context. So identity context, let's access the property called, my prop. I'm just making it up here. And now we can pass in any object, but I'm just going to stick with a string, and I'm going to pass in Alex here. And finally, we'll return the identity. Now we got to go back to the report so we can access my prop. Make sure your text box is selected again. In the value, let's just go back to the way it was, text box 2. And we're going to go to bindings again. And we're going to create that expression. We're going to bind the value just like before. And let's create a new expression. I want to access all the values in the context. And to do that, under functions, there's a function called item. This will allow us to index into the collection of the context. And I'm going to select 0 because I want the first item. Now we need to pass in the actual collection, and that's going to be in our user identity. We want to access the context here and values. So we're looking at all the values, but we're only pulling out the first one. Let's press OK and OK and save this. And let's take a look at our app. On the report page, when the report loads, you'll see that we have the value that we passed in from code, which is the string Alex. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at rendering and paging. In order to look at paging, we're going to go back to the report we had at the start of the course, which showed our list of data items as a table. So I've created a brand new report called RPS Table Report, and I've placed it in the same folder in our application. That's the reports folder, right next to the dashboard report. I'm going to go through this very quickly because you should be already familiar with how to set this up. The first thing I'm going to do is go to the Data tab and create a new SQL data source to create a new data connection. This time I'm going to build the connection string. There's my server name, and I'm going to use RPS as the database, test the connection. Looks like it was successful, and click OK. Click Next here. Share data connection is fine. And here's where I'm going to build a query for our select statement. Expand the database view and put a checkmark in PT items. This will bring up all the fields here in that table. Let's click OK, and you'll see the select statement with all our fields selected. Let's click Next here and execute query. And here you'll see a preview of all our data coming in, the first 10 rows. And now let's click Finish. So there's our new SQL data source. Make sure you select this and give our data source a new name that makes a little more sense. RPS data source sounds good. Now we're going to insert a table. So go to the Insert tab, select the body, which is the middle section of the report. And under the table dropdown, you'll see Table Wizard. Let's click on that. We want to select the RPS data source and click Next. Let's drag in a few fields here. Type, title, status, priority, estimate, and let's expand the date created field and drag in date. That looks pretty good. Let's click Next. This is the preview. Let's click Finish here. And to preview the actual data here, go to Home and then click on the Preview button. Now you should see the table of data come back. This is coming in live from the database. And you can see that there's quite a lot of items. We need some paging here. Make sure you save this and let's head back to our application. And if you don't already have it open up report.razor page. Right now, this is referencing our RPS dashboard report. Instead, we're going to reference RPS table report. And for the table report, make sure that the build action is set to content and also copy if newer for copy to output. All right, let's do a quick check here by running the application. And here we go. There's our table in the report. So now if we download the PDF of this data, for example, you'll see that we have automatic paging, but we can further customize and control how that looks. Now, the way this report looks are the default settings, but you can modify that. You can modify the margins, the paper size, the background color, border styles, watermarks, whether it's in landscape or portrait mode, and all these things can be modified in the report. Now, of course, pagination depends on the type of renderer that you use, and that's another topic that we can touch upon here. Telerik Reporting lets you use different renderers, and you can find them in the documentation under Style and Appearance, Rendering and Paging. Under Overview, here's a list of rendering extensions that can be used with reporting, PDF, these are for PDF files, Excel, CSV, and so on. Pretty self-explanatory what these are. There's just a lot of different types, but the key thing to understand here is there's different rendering behaviors depending on what kind of renderer you use. So for example, there's data renderers. An example of that is CSV, where paging doesn't matter because you just have a long list of data. There's logical page layout renderers, such as Excel, HTML, and then there's physical page layout renderers like image and PDF. We just saw a PDF renderer in action, and because of the nature of PDFs, they need to be rendered on multiple pages in order to show such a long list of data. With CSVs, you don't need to do that. Let's go to the report definition. Under Report Explorer, select the top node, which is the report itself, and in the properties under layout, you'll see page settings here. Let's open that up. Right now, the page settings is set to paper size of letter, but you have all these other options you can pick from. You can modify the margins or the orientation. We're going to try landscape here. Press OK. Let's take a look at what this looks like. So I'm going to refresh the page here, and the report looks exactly the same here in the report viewer on the page. But when we download this as a PDF now, you'll see that we have a different orientation. Now our pages are in landscape mode. Now, if you're making quick adjustments, you don't always need to go back to the application. You just need to click on Preview here in the Report Designer itself. By default, this is going to show you how the report will look like in a viewer, so not paged at all. But if you click on Print Preview, this will show you a paged version and how your page will render in a PDF, for example. So you can see that our landscape orientation is taking effect here. You can also export right here into different formats to see what that'll look like once downloaded. This will allow you to check what the report will look like at design time instead of waiting until it's in the application, in the report viewer. You can do it right here. Let's take a look at a couple more options under design. And under layout, you can see the unit of measure is inches here, the width of each page, page numbering style, and if blank pages are detected, you can either skip them or include them. Telerik Reporting offers the possibility to control the way numbers, dates, and currencies are displayed and to lay out text in different directions depending on the globalization settings of your machine. Your ASP.NET application will inherit the globalization settings of the machine, but you can also override that at any point. So any culture settings and regional settings, they trickle all the way down to the individual text boxes that represent report data. For example, let's take a look at the report as it is right now. We're going to run the app and go to the report page, and here it is. Here we have a table, and each one of these cells contains a text box, and each text box has its own culture settings. Now, the culture settings of the text box are inherited by default from the report, which in turn inherits it from the ASP.NET application where the report is hosted. But you can also override the culture of each text box. You can go to that granular level if you need to. To give you an example here, my current settings on this machine are set to United States and English, so my layout for text is left to right, and my dates and numbers are formatted according to United States English standards. Now, I'm on this Windows machine, and if I go to Control Panel and under Clock and Region Settings, change date and time and number formats, right now, this is Windows 11, which inherits it from the new UI, but you still have access to change everything here. It's set to English, United States, and it gives you an example what date and time formats are down here. So let's say I change this from the drop down to Arabic, Oman, for example. And you'll see that the short dates are going to be like this, and the numbers are also going to be affected. Let's click apply here, and I'm going to go back to my application. I'm going to have to restart my application, so it takes the new culture settings into account. Let's go to the report page, and you'll see that now our layouts are right to left instead of left to right, and our dates and numbers are in Arabic. Notice the priority field. It's a number and it's in Arabic. We're going to override this priority column. Let's go back to Report Designer. And this is the report. It's open here in Report Designer. Select the priority text box. This is an auto-generated text box when you drop in a table control. If we go to Report Explorer, you'll see that here is the tree, and there's the table and the column groups and the row groups, and here is that text box that I've just selected. This one happens to be called text box 10. In the properties box, let's go to the culture settings. Right now it's set to default, but we can override that. And let's say I want to select English US here. Let's save this report and restart our application one more time. Let's go to the report page. Now you see that most of the report is Arabic, except for the one priority column where I provided the override for the culture to be a different language and region. Besides the desktop report designer that we've been using all along, there's also Web Report Designer. This is the component that we can drop into a web application that allows you to introduce report authoring to your end users. Thus, they can create or modify reports ad hoc. Now, when you installed Telerik Report Designers, it installed a few samples, and we're going to explore those samples as one of them already has Report Designer integrated. So let's have a look. Here I am in Visual Studio, and I'm going to open a project or solution, and I'm going to go to where reporting was installed. Program files, x86, progress, Telerik reporting, examples, C#. I'm using .NET, but there's a few solutions listed down here that include that project. Let's take a look at C# Blazor native example. Now we're on .NET 8, so I'm going to make sure that the .NET 8 project is set up as a startup project. Let's have a look in there. Select report examples VS 2022. That's the version of Visual Studio I'm on right now. And this one has a .NET 8 folder. Let's expand that. The project that I'm interested in is the C#.NET 8 HTML5 integration demo. If that's not in bold, I'm going to right click on it and say set a startup project, and let's run it. We've looked at Telerik reporting demos on their website before. This is the same exact demo here with a report that's linked out to different report examples. So for example, here's the dashboard report. This might look familiar to you if you've seen the demos on the Telerik reporting website. Now, if we take a look at Solution Explorer and open up this project in the www root folder, you'll notice that we have the index page. That's the one we were just looking at. But there's also the Web Report Designer page. To view it, go back to the running application, and instead of index.html, let's type in webreportdesigner.html in the address bar, and this will bring up the Web Report Designer with a welcome tour. If this is the first time you're looking at it, this will just guide you through some of the parts of the Web Report Designer, since it is a bit different in layout than the desktop version. The design surface is in the middle, just as before. This is where you have the header, the details, and the footer. and you can change the layout, select items, and move things around. Instead of the Insert tab that was in the desktop version, here we have the component list on the left side, where you can drag in text boxes, pictures, shapes, panels, tables, charts, and so on. Instead of the Report Explorer that was on the right side, on the left side in the Web Report Designer, we have the Explorer. And this will give you the outline of the current report, as well as the data sources that are involved in it. On the right side, we have the Properties area. Once you select an item in the Explorer or on the design surface, you'll be able to see its properties pop up on the right and edit them. And of course, there's a menu where you can create new reports, save reports, and so on. The report preview has its own button right at the top. You can check your report as you're designing it. Right now, there's an example report loaded up with its own data source already configured. There's the select statement that you can edit right there. This report has a parameter called Culture ID that allows you to switch between languages. And the available values are coming in from SQL Data Source 2. If we preview this report, you'll see exactly what that means. Here is the report right here. And we have language selection on the right side as the parameter. If you need a reminder about parameters and how they work, you can find that earlier in this chapter. So here we can switch between different languages and you'll see the language updated in the report. Let's take a closer look at the project to see what's been configured to make this possible. First of all, we have the Web Report Designer page, which uses the HTML5 Web Report Designer wrapper, essentially a JavaScript component that configures the Report Designer control, and it points to a Web API URL. It points to the sample report, which is the product catalog, and you can configure starting the Report Designer either in preview or design mode. So if we look at the controllers here, you'll see that there's the Report Design controller, and it's similar to the Report controller, but there's a different base class from Telerik Reporting. This one is coming from Telerik.Web Report Designer namespace. Telerik Reporting also installs Visual Studio templates to help you get set up and to make the integration of Web Report Designer much easier. For example, if I wanted to add the Web Report Designer to our application, our RPS application, I can use the Visual Studio templates to do that. I'd go to Add, New Item, and then search for Report. And in the templates, you'll find that Telerik Web Report Designer is listed here. There's the HTML5 wrapper version that we've just looked at, and there's also the Telerik Blazor Report Designer version as well. Both of these will launch a wizard that's similar to the wizard we've seen when we did the report viewer page. Keep an eye on the documentation for any additional information or changes that might happen in the Web Report Designer. In the docs under Creating Reports, you can take a look at Report Designers, Web Report Designer, and relevant information in here. How to set it up in .NET, Blazor applications, and other important details.